They mocked the janitor, until she fired the CEO right in the boardroom. When the most overlooked person in the company became the most powerful, no one saw it coming. The office was buzzing with the energy of the early morning rush, but no one paid attention as Margaret Foster quietly entered through the side door, pushing her cleaning cart at her usual steady pace. She wore her navy blue uniform like armor, her expression calm and unreadable, betraying none of the emotions she kept carefully tucked away. To the executives at Crestwell and Company, she was invisible, just the janitor, the woman who wiped their desks, emptied their trash, and occasionally exchanged polite nods with the few who acknowledged her existence. Margaret, now in her late 50s, had spent nearly a decade working in the towering Chicago headquarters of Crestwell and Company, a financial consulting firm known for its cutthroat culture. She had grown accustomed to the dismissive looks and the snide remarks that executives made when they assumed she wasn't listening. "She's just standing there. Doesn't she have something to clean?" Someone had muttered last week as she quietly waited outside the conference room, patiently waiting for a meeting to end. But Margaret never reacted. She never did. She kept her head down, her hands steady as she worked. What they didn't know, what no one in that office knew, was that Margaret had a secret so powerful that it could turn the entire company on its head. Margaret wasn't impulsive. She believed in patience, in watching, in waiting. But today, as she walked down the hallways, her calm demeanor hid the fact that she was nearing her breaking point. The morning unfolded as usual. Margaret polished the glass doors until they gleamed, vacuumed the plush carpet in the executive wing, and straightened the cluttered desks of those who barely noticed her presence. But one conversation made her pause. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, it wasn't in her nature, but the voices were loud enough to demand her attention. "The shareholders' meeting is next week," one executive said, his tone smug. "We've got nothing to worry about. The board loves our numbers, and Mr. Larkin is untouchable." Margaret's grip on her cart tightened. They had no idea how wrong they were. But she didn't dwell on it for long. There was still work to do, and she needed to be ready. Crestwell and Company prided itself on its sleek, modern image. Its headquarters, a towering glass building in the middle of downtown Chicago, was often featured in business magazines as a symbol of corporate success. Inside, however, the reality was far less glamorous. The company thrived on ruthless ambition, where the higher you climbed, the less you cared about anyone beneath you. Margaret had seen it all in her years there. Unqualified executives getting promotions because they knew the right people. Employees covering up mistakes by blaming those who had no power to defend themselves. Whispered backroom deals that kept the same corrupt leaders in charge. And at the top of it all sat Paul Larkin, the CEO. A man who ruled by intimidation, Paul was the kind of leader who commanded respect through fear. His deep voice boomed in meetings, silencing even the boldest executives. To him, people were nothing more than pawns, tools to be used and discarded. Margaret had overheard his sarcastic remarks about employees he deemed unworthy. "Why is she still here?" he had once scoffed, not realizing she was just outside the door listening. What he failed to realize was that Margaret wasn't just a janitor. She was the majority shareholder of Crestwell and Company. And today, she was going to fire him. The shareholders' meeting was held in the grand conference room, with executives seated around the polished mahogany table. The air was thick with self-importance. Paul Larkin sat at the head, exuding his usual arrogance. He didn't even glance at Margaret as she entered, assuming she was just there to tidy up. She wasn't. Margaret walked to the front of the room and set a thick folder on the table. The murmurs started immediately. Paul looked up, finally noticing her. His smirk faltered. "Can I help you?" he asked, irritation creeping into his voice. Margaret straightened her shoulders and spoke clearly. "Actually, Mr. Larkin, I'm here to help the company. You see, I own 52% of Crestwell and Company." The room went silent. Paul let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "What?" Margaret smiled. "I've watched this company operate from the inside for years. I know where the money goes, who gets the promotions, and who covers up the bad deals. And as of today, I'm using my authority as majority shareholder to make some changes starting with you." Paul's face turned scarlet. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" Margaret calmly slid a legal document across the table. "Actually, I can. This is your official termination letter, effective immediately." Gasps rippled across the room. A security officer stepped forward. "Mr. Larkin, I need you to leave." For the first time, Paul was speechless. As he stormed out, Margaret finally felt relief. She had waited years for this moment. And now, she wasn't just the janitor. She was the CEO. They mocked the janitor until she took over the company. No one noticed Margaret Foster as she made her way through the sleek hallways of Linden & Wells, a major corporate firm in New York City. At 58 years old, she had spent nearly a decade working as a janitor in the company's headquarters. She was invisible to the executives, the woman who emptied their trash, wiped their desks, and listened as they made snide remarks, assuming she didn't exist. She had learned to ignore the dismissive looks, the way people spoke down to her, or how they treated her like part of the furniture. But Margaret had a secret. And soon, every person in that office would know her name. Margaret overheard Paul Whitmore, the CEO, speaking about one of the older receptionists. "Why haven't we retired her yet?" he scoffed. "She's been here forever, and it's not like she's adding value." His tone was sharp, dripping with arrogance. But it wasn't just the words, it was the culture. Margaret had witnessed unethical practices being swept under the rug. Bonuses quietly cut for lower-level staff, while executives celebrated record profits. Inflated expense reports, shady client dealings, and even the quiet firing of a whistleblower. Janitorial staff treated as nothing more than a nuisance, scolded over the smallest details. She had seen her co-workers brought to tears after being reprimanded for leaving a single speck of dust behind. She had watched paychecks stagnate, even as workloads increased. The worst part? The constant dismissal of humanity. No one looked them in the eyes. No one acknowledged them. They were invisible. One moment burned in Margaret's memory. A young intern had spilled coffee on the pristine marble floor near Paul Whitmore's office. The intern froze, clearly terrified, as Paul rounded the corner. "Are you kidding me?" he snapped. Then his eyes landed on Margaret, who had just walked by with her mop and bucket. "Clean this up," he barked, as if she were at fault. Margaret didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The intern apologized profusely, but Paul waved him off like he was nothing. To him, people like Margaret and that intern were just background noise. Over the years, these moments piled up. Each one was another stone added to a growing mountain. Margaret had an impressive level of patience, but she wasn't immune to the weight of it all. She felt the sting of disrespect, the exhaustion of being overlooked. But Margaret had never been the type to crumble. She stored those moments away like ammunition, waiting for the day she would need them. She wasn't just watching, she was planning. Because what no one knew was that Margaret was the largest shareholder of Linden & Wells. Her late husband, Charles, had been one of the original investors in the company. At the time, no one believed in its success. He had quietly accumulated shares, and by the time of his passing, those shares had become a controlling stake. At first, Margaret didn't know what to do with this power. She wasn't a corporate strategist or a businesswoman. She was just Margaret, a woman who had raised 2 kids, fought through life's challenges, and found solace in routine. But as she continued working in the background, she listened. She observed. She learned. And the more she learned, the more she realized the company's success came at the expense of its people. The moment that pushed her over the edge came during a late-night shift. Margaret had just finished cleaning the executive lounge when she overheard 2 senior managers laughing over drinks. They were talking about layoffs, joking about how easy it was to cut people without anyone caring. Some of these employees act like their jobs actually matter. One of them laughed. They don't realize how replaceable they are. Margaret froze behind the door. Her hand tightened around the cleaning cloth. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These were real people. People with families, bills, and dreams. Yet to these men, they were expendable assets. That night, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table, a notepad in front of her. She started writing, not sure where it would lead, but knowing she couldn't stay silent anymore. She listed the unethical practices she had witnessed, the people who had been mistreated, the moments that stuck with her, and then she made a decision. At the next board meeting, she wouldn't be invisible anymore. Margaret walked into the boardroom the following Monday, dressed in a sharp navy suit, not the janitor's uniform they were used to seeing. The room fell silent. Paul Whitmore barely spared her a glance, assuming she was there to clean. Until she took a seat at the head of the table. Paul frowned. "Excuse me, but—" Margaret slid a folder across the table. "Paul, you're fired." The boardroom erupted. Gasps. Murmurs. Disbelief. Paul turned pale. "What?" Margaret leaned forward. "I own 55% of this company. As of today, you're no longer CEO." Paul stammered, but security was already waiting. As he was escorted out, Margaret finally felt at peace. For years they had treated her like nothing, but now she was the most powerful person in the room, and no one saw it coming. The cleaning lady, no one noticed, until she took over the company. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through her apartment window, Margaret Foster had finished outlining a plan that would change everything. For years, she had been invisible in the halls of Linden and Wells, the New York City-based corporate firm where she worked as a janitor. But no more. Step 1. Gather the evidence. Margaret had an advantage that none of the executives ever considered: access. No one thought twice about her when she was cleaning offices late at night. No one lowered their voices when she entered a conference room. No one locked their desks before leaving for the day. She took mental notes, memorized schedules, and even glanced at documents left carelessly on desks. She wasn't stealing or snooping. She was assembling the truth-own piece at a time. Step 2. Call for reinforcements. Margaret couldn't do this alone. She reached out to people she trusted, former employees who had been pushed out, lawyers who understood corporate law, and financial analysts who could make sense of the company's hidden secrets. Slowly, they helped her craft a strategy, not just to expose the toxic culture of Linden and Wells, but to secure its future. Step 3. Confront the boardroom. This was the hardest part. Margaret had spent her life being dismissed, but this time she wouldn't be ignored. She practiced her speech in the mirror, her voice steady and firm. She reminded herself that this wasn't just about her. It was about every employee who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or undervalued. And she was ready. The day of reckoning. The morning of the shareholders' meeting arrived with a buzz of excitement. The executives strutted through the hallways, their chatter filled with confidence about another year of record profits. None of them noticed Margaret, pushing her cleaning cart toward the top-floor boardroom, her face as calm and unreadable as always. The boardroom was a stark contrast to the rest of the office-polished wood, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the New York City skyline, and a long mahogany table where the most powerful people in the company sat. At the head of the table, CEO Paul Whitmore leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence and arrogance. Margaret entered quietly, as she always did. She placed a pitcher of water on the side table. No one acknowledged her. To them, she was just part of the backdrop. But this time, Margaret didn't leave. "Excuse me." Her voice cut through the air like a blade. The room fell silent. Heads turned, confused and slightly annoyed. Paul barely glanced at her. "We're in the middle of something," he said dismissively. Margaret took a step forward, her voice steady. "I know. That's why I'm here." Paul's smirk widened, dripping with condescension. "Unless you're here to clean up after us, I suggest you leave." Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled a folder from her cart and placed it on the table. The Linden and Wells logo gleamed on the cover. The words, "Shareholders Report." The room fell completely silent. Paul's smirk faltered. Margaret met his eyes. "For years I have watched this company thrive on the backs of people you refuse to see." Her voice was unwavering. "I have witnessed employees mistreated, ethical lines crossed, and profits prioritized over humanity." She opened the folder. "And I have stayed silent until now." The takeover. Murmurs erupted around the table. One of the board members leaned forward, squinting at the folder. "What is this?" Margaret flipped the first page. "Proof." She looked around the room, her presence no longer unnoticed. "Proof of the unethical practices, financial mismanagement, and outright disregard for the people who make this company run." Paul's voice boomed across the room. "Who do you think you are?" His voice carried rage, disbelief. "You're a janitor." Margaret met his glare with calm confidence. "No, Mr. Whitmore." She stood tall. "I am the majority shareholder of Linden and Wells." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And as of today, you are no longer the CEO." The shockwave. The words hit like a thunderclap. Paul's face paled. His confident demeanor crumbled. "You're joking." His voice trembled slightly. Margaret didn't blink. "No, Mr. Whitmore, I'm not." She turned to the board members, her gaze unwavering. Paul stammered, his desperation clear. But security was already waiting. As he was escorted out, Margaret finally felt at peace. For years they had treated her like nothing. Now, she was the most powerful person in the room, and no one saw it coming. The cleaning lady no one noticed until she took over the company. Margaret Foster stood tall in the boardroom, her gaze unwavering as chaos erupted around her. She had spent years gathering evidence, and now it was all laid out in front of them: the inflated expense reports, the unethical layoffs, the harassment complaints, buried under stacks of paperwork. "I have the power to vote him out," she said, her voice sharp, "and I'm using it." The fall of the CEO, Paul Whitmore, the once untouchable CEO of Linden and Wells, was desperate. He tried to argue, his voice rising, but it was futile. One by one, the board members turned to Margaret, flipping through the documents confirming her claims. The vote didn't take long. The evidence was undeniable, and by that same afternoon, Paul Whitmore was officially removed from his position. Security escorted him out of the building, his protests falling on deaf ears. Margaret remained standing, her back straight, her expression calm. The executives who had once ignored her now stared at her with a mix of awe and guilt. But Margaret wasn't looking for their approval. She had bigger plans. A company transformed. By the next morning, the entire office was buzzing. The break rooms, hallways, and conference calls were filled with the same question. How could the cleaning lady, quiet, unassuming Margaret Ave, been the majority shareholder all along? The whispers were no longer dismissive. They were filled with respect, admiration, and a tinge of guilt. Margaret, however, wasn't there to bask in attention. She returned to the office not with a mop and bucket, but with a clipboard and a plan. A culture shift. Margaret hadn't just removed a toxic CEO, she was there to change the company's future. She began with the people who had been overlooked for years. Raises were given to the cleaning staff and other underappreciated employees. Harassment and discrimination complaints were no longer ignored. She introduced a third-party watchdog to ensure transparency. The toxic culture that had festered under Paul's leadership was addressed head-on. The board, once complicit, now found themselves held accountable. Margaret insisted on regular training programs focused on ethics, inclusion, and employee well-being. For the first time in years, employees at Linden and Wells felt seen, heard, and valued. A new vision. Margaret didn't just change Policius, she changed the way the company operated. She hosted town hall meetings, inviting employees at all levels to share their experiences and ideas. She listened, took notes, and made sure that every voice mattered. One afternoon, as she was walking through the office, a young intern stopped her. It was the same intern who had spilled coffee near Paul Whitmore's office months ago. He hesitated for a moment, then said sincerely, "Thank you for everything. You've changed this place." Margaret smiled. "No," she said gently, "we changed this place together." A legacy of change. Outside the Linden and Wells headquarters, the New York skyline glittered in the late afternoon sun. Margaret stood for a moment, looking up at the towering glass structure she had once entered unnoticed. It had been a long road, but she had done what many thought was impossible. This wasn't just about firing a CEO or exposing corruption. It was about proving that no matter how invisible someone might feel, they have the power to create meaningful change. Margaret had proven that resilience, patience, and integrity could triumph over arrogance and greed. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. And then she walked away. Not to fade into the background, but to embrace a new chapter. The lesson: life often underestimates the quiet strength of those who observe, endure, and act when the time is right. Margaret's story is a reminder that the most unexpected people can become the catalysts for profound change. If you found her journey inspiring, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, for more stories that prove the power of resilience and justice.